Hello everyone, in this session we are going to discuss about how to read data from different databases into Python. To read data from different databases and their respective tables into Python, there are mainly two ways. The very first way is using individual connector of respective database, and another way is using SQLAlchemy. So we are going to quickly discuss these two methods, that how can we read data using any of these methods. To read data from MySQL database, you will need two packages mainly. The very first package is MySQL connector Python. This is the specific connector for MySQL for Python. And another package is SQLAlchemy. The third package is Pandas, but Pandas is again going to use SQLAlchemy to read data from MySQL database. So I have already installed MySQL connector Python, SQLAlchemy and Pandas packages into the system, and their respective versions are as shown on the screen. The very first method that we are going to look at is using MySQL connector Python package. So first we are going to import the package mysql.connector. Then we are going to use its connect function, in which we are going to provide host, port, username of the database, password of the database, and the database from which we want to read the data. In this host scenario, right now I have written localhost because my database is lying on the same machine, on the same host where my Python scripts are, and that's why I have used localhost. But in case this MySQL database has been deployed at some other location, in that case you need to provide the IP address of that particular server. Second thing is port. The default port for MySQL is 3306, but in case the port is also different, then you need to provide that particular port name. Then we are going to create a cursor object as shown on the screen. So this particular object will be used to execute SQL queries. Then this is the query to read the data. Then we will execute that query. Next thing is we are going to fetch all the rows. If you don't want to fetch all the rows, in that case you can utilize this command fetch one as well. In this case only one row will be returned. Next is if you want to get column names, then this is the command that you can utilize to get the column names of that particular data, and then we need to iterate over rows to print that particular data. And at last we need to make sure that we are closing cursor and the connection so that there is no overhead of connections. This entire code is similar to the code that we have seen just above this particular step. The only difference is we are using with context manager over here, so that we don't need to close this connection and cursor manually. Next example to read data from MySQL database is using Pandas with the combination of MySQL.connector. So over here the code will be, first we need to import MySQL.connector package, then we need to import Pandas package, then we need to define a connection. That means we need to create a connection with MySQL database, providing all the required details, and finally we can use this command read_SQL with the query that we want to execute and the connection that we have just defined. And using this particular command, we will get Pandas data frame as shown on the screen. Apart from that, you can see that over here we are getting a warning that Pandas only support SQLAlchemy connectable. Okay, so to overcome this particular warning, we will review the next cell. In this particular cell, we are going to read data from MySQL database using Pandas and SQLAlchemy combination. For this, again, we need to import packages Pandas, SQLAlchemy, port plus function. The requirement for this particular package and its particular function is if your password contains @ in that particular scenario, in that particular case, if you are going to use that particular password having @ without encoding it, you will get an error, because in SQLAlchemy is reserved word. It's a reserved character, and hence you cannot use it as is in your connection string. Okay, so to work with SQLAlchemy and to work with @ in your password, you need to encode your password using this code plus function from this urllib.parse package. Then you need to provide this connection string. So in this connection string, this is my database, MySQL, then the connector that we are going to use to connect with MySQL. Instead of this MySQL connector, you can use PyMySQL as well. Then this is your username, that is database username, or the user who has rights to read data from this particular database or its respective tables. Then encoded password, because my password contains @. If my password does not have this @, then I can skip this particular step and I can directly put this password over here. Then @localhost, because my database is on the same machine where my Python scripts are lying. If my SQL database has been deployed somewhere else, I need to provide that particular IP address, that port of that MySQL database service, and then database name. Next part is we are going to create an SQLAlchemy engine using that connection string. Then we are going to define the query that we want to execute. Finally, with pandas read_SQL command, we are going to read the data which will be in the pandas data frame as shown on the string. Finally, we are going to look at the SQLAlchemy package using which we can read data from the database. Over here, we are going to import two things: create engine and text from SQLAlchemy, and code plus function from urllib.parse. The reason for this is my password contains @, and @ is a reserved character in SQLAlchemy. So I need to encode my password using this code plus function. Then I need to define the connection string similar to above, and then I need to create an engine using that connection string. Then I will connect with MySQL database. Then using this text, I will provide the SQL query that I want to execute. Finally, I'm going to execute the query. For columns, I need to use this command result.keys. So result is the variable name through which we have executed our query. And finally, I need to iterate over rows to print the data. And finally, I need to close the connection and need to close the engine using this dispose command. And you can see that I have got the column names and the data as shown on the string. Next, we are going to talk about how to read data from PostgreSQL. Again, over here, the scenario will be similar, that I will need to use PsychoPG2, that is the specific connector to read data from PostgreSQL database. And apart from that, SQLAlchemy, which I can utilize to read the data from PostgreSQL. And definitely Pandas is also there, which is going to use SQLAlchemy to read the data from PostgreSQL. And the version of these respective packages are as shown on the string. To read data from PostgreSQL using PsychoPG2 package, first we need to import PsychoPG2 package. Then using its connect function, we are going to provide host name, port name, user, password, and database details to connect with PostgreSQL database. Then we are going to use with context manager so that we don't need to close the connections manually. And finally, we are going to define query, which we are going to execute to fetch the data. And for columns, we need to execute this particular command. And again, I need to iterate over rows to get the data. Using Pandas and PsychoPG2, it will be similar to MySQL as we have seen above. Like I need to import PsychoPG2 package and I need to import Pandas package. Then I need to define connection using required details of host, port, user, password, and database, and then .read_SQL, the query that I want to execute, and the connection object, using which I will be able to read the data. Using Pandas SQLAlchemy, it will be similar to again MySQL one. Like I need to import Pandas, then SQLAlchemy create engine function, and URL lib.parse its code plus function. Though over here my password does not contain @, hence I can skip this particular step and I can directly provide this particular password over here. Next, I need to provide the connection string where this PostgreSQL is my database, Postgres is my username, this is the password, @server where the PostgreSQL database has been deployed. If it is on the same machine where your Python scripts are, then it will be localhost, and if not, then over here you need to provide the IP address. Then port on which the service is listening, and this is the database name. Then we need to create an engine using that connection string, and then using this query we can fetch the data using read.sql function of Pandas. Using SQLAlchemy only, similar to again MySQL part, it will be importing create engine and text functionality from SQLAlchemy. And if your password contains @, then you need to import this package as well. Again, define connection string, define an engine, connect to that PostgreSQL database, execute the query, get the columns, and iterate over rows to fetch the data. Next, we are going to talk about MSSQL. So to work with MSSQL, you need to download Microsoft ODBC driver for SQL Server by visiting the particular URL. Then the packages that we are going to utilize to read data from MSSQL are PyODBC, Pandas, and SQLAlchemy. The versions of those specific packages are as shown on the screen. Over here, I have defined MSSQL Server properties. Like this is the server address. It is localhost. Otherwise, you can provide IP address. Over here, this is the port on which the service is listening. This is the database name, this is the username, and this is the password. Now, using PyODBC package, we are going to read data from MSSQL. So, first of all, we need to import the package, then we need to define the connection string. Over here, the connection string for specific to PyODBC will be similar to as shown over here on the screen. So, over here, driver equal to, you need to write this ODBC driver 18 for SQL Server. Make sure that you are providing the correct version. So it can be like ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server, or it can be 16 for SQL Server. So based on whatever the ODBC driver version you have got, you need to write it over here within this double curly braces. Then server equal to server. So this is the server that we have defined above. Then database equal to the database that we have defined above, UID equal to username that we have defined above, password that we have defined above, and then we need to say trust server certificate equal to yes, because if we do not provide this particular option, then we might get SSL error, and that's why we have included this particular option. Then we are going to use with context manager, and using it we are going to define a connection which will be connected to the MSSQL database. Then we are going to create cursor object. Using that cursor object, we are going to execute the SQL query. Then we will fetch all the rows. For columns, we need to execute this command, and then we need to iterate over rows to print the data. Next is using Pandas SQLAlchemy. So over here, one more package that we need to use is URL lib.parse and its port plus function, because my password contains @. So over here I need to create connection string. So again over here MSSQL is my database name, PyODBC is the connector that I am going to use to connect with MSSQL database, then username, then encoded password because password contains @, then server database, then question marks, driver equal to ODBC driver 18 for SQL Server. Now over here, make sure that based on your ODBC driver version, you put either 18 or 17 or 16, and then end trust server certificate equal to yes. So using this connection string, we will be able to read data from MSSQL database using pandas read underscore SQL function using SQLAlchemy. So over here, we need to import create engine and text function. And as my password contains @ I need to use code plus. So I will encode my password using this code plus function. Then I'm going to define connection string, which will be similar to the above cell. Okay, so this is the database MSSQL, then PyODBC, which is a connector to connect with MSSQL database, then username, encoded password, server, then over here database to which I want to connect, that is the database name. This is the database name. Then question mark, driver equal to ODBC driver 18 for SQL server. So based on your ODBC driver version, it can be 18 or 17 or 16 or anything. And then trust server certificate equal to yes. Then using that connection string, we are going to create an engine. Using that engine, we are going to connect with MSSQL database. Then we are going to define a query, that is the SQL query, to read data from particular table. Then using that query, we are going to execute. For columns, we need to use this result.keys. So result is the variable in which we have executed the query. And finally, we need to iterate over rows to fetch the data, means to print the data. Okay, and finally, we are going to close the connection so that there is no overhead of different connections. That's it for the day. Thank you for watching this video.